Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by a returning guest, Gerrit Bruhaug, our in-house fusion expert. Garrett is a Decouple veteran. We'll be referencing back to our first podcast together, the nuclear fusion energy delusion ? But in short, Garrett is a nuclear engineer with a background in fission and particle accelerators, now at the University of Rochester, working on his PhD, blasting things with huge lasers. And so I thought, after hearing the announcement from the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, where I think 172 lasers were blasted at a little fuel pellet, that I should talk to my man Garrett again. And he has been so gracious as to join us. So Garrett, welcome back to Decouple, man.
Happy to be back, Chris, and happy to talk about the exciting news and maybe bring some clarity to it.
That would be helpful. I'm not sure how you feel about, fusion journalism as someone who's, deep on the inside. But maybe we could just start with that, actually. I mean, what's your kind of reaction to the way that the public has been discussing what happened at, we'll just start calling it Triple L, Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. I've also heard it referred to as lasers.
We actually usually call it LLNL or just Livermore or those goddamn guys in Livermore more often. But yeah, fusion journalism is possibly some of the worst journalism out there, period. No matter which way you want to cut it, it's either hype to a disgusting degree. Even if you are a big fan of fusion, it gets overboard, or there is almost pessimism to a disgusting degree. It feels like it takes everything from the bad stuff with general energy journalism and just turns it to 11.
So that's a good way to put it. So you were mentioning, those bastards down at Livermore. So you also shoot lasers. I did a real quick intro there, but just tell us, for listeners that, haven't been with us for the last 100 episodes when we recorded our first fusion podcast. Just tell us a little bit more about yourself before we dive into the exciting announcement from Triple L or Livermore, as you refer to it.
Yeah, so like you said, my background is originally fission. I've actually operated a fission reactor, worked on accelerators, did all that fun stuff out in Idaho. And then, as many young nuclear engineers do, you catch the fusion bug and get convinced that that's the thing to go do. And unlike many other people, I pretty quickly realized I didn't like the magnetic confinement method of fusion, which I'm sure we'll dive into shortly. I thought this laser thing sounded fun. And so I went out to the University of Rochester, which has the largest laser at any university in the world. It's a facility so big, if you came out here and I told you it wasn't a national lab, you would think I'm a liar. A $90 million a year budget. And we have two enormous lasers, one of which does very similar work to the machine at Livermore. And it's kind of the little sister, or more like the older sister, but also smaller, called Omega, which has 60 lasers all aimed inwards to implode targets and generate fusion conditions, among many other exciting bits of science. And so I work with Omega and its sister laser, Omega EP, which is a different laser that we don't have to dive into, that to study the physics involved in all of this. And specifically, my thesis work is on generating radiation sources to act as kind of like a flash bulb to look at what's going on in these experiments, because they are very messy, very fast, very small, very dense. So we don't really know what's happening beyond, oh boy, a lot of energy goes in, and oh boy, a lot of radiation comes out. We've gotten a lot better in the past 20 years, but it's still hard.
So I re-listened to our initial episode, and it really is a good one. You're an amazing guest, and I did a lot of research on that show and impressed myself. I have a pretty good short-term memory. I think that's how I got into med school. I was able to, memorize and crush those multiple choice pre-med courses pretty well. My long-term memory, not so much. And as you know, we had to reschedule this episode because I got a bonk on the head recently. So I do want to, revisit the basics. We always talk about spaced repetition as being a really key tool to finally learn something or remember it. For those of us not bright enough to grasp it on the first time. But before we get to, I guess maybe some kind of rapid fire stuff to get everybody up to base on some fusion basics. Why don't you clarify for me this news out of Triple L? What happened? I heard they shot a big laser at a pellet and they got more energy out than they put in. But if you can expand on that slightly, that would be helpful for us.
Yeah, so before getting into the real specifics of types of fusion, what specifically happened at Livermore and why everyone was so excited. And I'm very excited. I mean, we were all just absolutely pumped when we heard the news. Being in the biz, I heard it a lot earlier than the rest of you. I got a text about 2 a.m. About what had happened. But they passed what's called the ignition threshold. And interestingly enough, we kind of did this last year, but the US government set a very specific legal limit on what counts as ignition. A scientist will argue back and forth as to what it is, but there was a specific number that they had to pass. And some of that has to do with some of the history, with Livermore being a bit of a politically aggressive lab. And some of it's just for clarity. There can be no games. You just have to pass this number. And so the lasers themselves can generate 2 megajoules of laser energy. They consume a lot more, but 2 megajoules of laser energy goes in to actually affect the fusion fuel. And we got more than 3 megajoules out. And we call that ignition. That means that the fusion chain reaction was self-sustaining. It was self-heating. And more importantly, although there's 2 megajoules going in, there's just a bazillion inefficiencies. So when we actually look at how much heat went into the fusion fuel, it's more like 29 kilojoules of actual heat. And so almost all of the heat that was keeping the reaction going was generated by fusion itself. We have never done that in a lab, ever. That is completely new. We've only ever done that in thermonuclear weapons. And the reason that this is important, even with all the issues that we'll dive into about the system, you can think about this like learning to light a fire. And I'm going to crib from a wonderful article from Robert Zubrin about this. If you're a caveman and you see, or a cavewoman, or see lightning coming in, hitting things and lighting fires, and go, man, it'd be cool to be able to light that fire. But I don't have a lightning bolt, or in the case of humans, we don't want to use the lightning bolt we have. I want to be able to light it on a small scale. And so you sit there and you work 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 and you get a little bit of an ember and a little bit of wood to burn. That's useless. That's utterly useless, except for the fact that you now know how to light the fire. And you can get better and better and better at it. And you can use that little bit of burning to light a bigger fire to eventually, thousands of years later, build a power plant or whatever. So this is the very tiny little first step that had to happen. There can be no fusion power plants without reaching this. There can be no fusion anything without reaching this point. And it has been the goal of decades and decades of work to reach ignition. So it is a big scientific deal. And that's the thing I want to emphasize, scientific deal.
And this is the National Ignition Laboratory, or NIF,
Facility.
NIL facility. It was named Ignition, and from what I heard, I think in a side conversation with you, is that they were anticipating this was going to happen a long time ago. This lab was built some time ago, and it was a little humbling how long it took. But again, just to make sure I've got this right, the first time that humans ever succeeded with a fusion reaction, certainly ignition, a sustained reaction where the energy, wasn't just individual pulses, but it sustained itself, was Ivy Mike, was our kind of hydrogen bomb explosion. And when you think about, we're going to be making lots of fission fusion comparisons, but fission being essentially getting a neutron to hit an already very unstable, enormous atom, which is relatively easy, and we saw that in the progress from the Chicago pile to the Nautilus and to shipping port happening in a relatively short period of time. The amount of energy in to make fusion happen or sustain it is crazy. It took fission. It took a fission explosion. I believe those thermonuclear bombs, fission sets off the fusion, right? It just gives you a sense, I think, of what a challenge this is and what an accomplishment it is.
Yeah, it's extremely challenging. And what specifically the kind of comparison to think about is the energy density, or more specifically the power density, to be able to ignite that reaction. And this is part of why NIF was built the way it was built. Those lasers mimicked the power density of a fission explosive.
Wow.
To be able to drive that same sort of system to happen. But fission gives us a cheat code. I could just get 9 kilos of plutonium and do it as well, but that's not a very productive way forward.
Might produce a little bit of fallout.
A little bit.
So, and maybe this is a jumping off point to just get a little bit into the theory and just some super basics here. But, fusion happens in the sun, and it happens quite easily. Why is it that it's so hard to do on Earth?
So fusion has extreme conditions to reach. When you look at the sun, yes, it does happen easily, although it happens rarely. It's always fun to point out the power density of the sun is equivalent to about a person. It's just the sun is really, 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 really big. So that adds up to a lot of power coming out in total. And the sun is doing the hardest kind of fusion called proton-proton fusion. Very, very rare because of that, has low power density, very hard to make react. But any kind of fusion, the one done at NIF is the quote-unquote easiest, called deuterium-tritium fusion, where we use two isotopes of heavy hydrogen, both provided by Canada. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Straight from Candu's. Those have the lowest requirements for fusion, but fusion by lowest, it's still very, very, very challenging. We have to reach temperatures.
When you say the lowest requirements, you mean the lowest amount of energy in order to initiate fusion?
So what we like to talk about is something called the Lawson criterion, and that's just a rough, weird, random number to compare this all to, where we just multiply a bunch of different things together. But effectively, what you need to do is reach a certain temperature so that the cross-section or probability of fusion becomes high enough to even matter. There's always a probability of fusion. There's probably a fusion event happening in the ocean right now, but it's so rare it doesn't matter. But we need it to actually become high enough to start to matter. So that only happens at temperatures at hundreds of millions of degrees or billions of degrees. Pick any unit you want, it doesn't matter. It all ends up being hundreds of millions to billions. And then we need to hold that plasma that gets made. So at those temperatures, matter is no longer normal matter. All the electrons are stripped off and they're just free flying around. We need to hold that stuff for a certain period of time to get the reactions to actually happen at a rate that matters. And we would specifically like to hold it long enough so they start self-heating, so that when the fusion reaction heat goes off, it generates more heat to keep the whole thing together, so we don't have to keep heating it ourselves. And to reach that Lawson criterion, you have to get very, very, very insanely high temperatures, and you have to either hold the plasma for a long period of time or generate really crazy pressures. The sun does both. At the National Ignition Facility, we reach very high temperatures and we reach insane pressures. The hydrogen at the National Ignition Facility is compressed so much, it is more like a kilo. So hydrogen is like 0.07 grams per cc density normally as an ice. We freeze it into an ice before we compress it. It goes up to more than a kilo per cc. So it's like 100 times lead density. And then it's also 1 billion degrees. So that's the sort of insanity you need to reach. And that's for the easy fuel. It just gets harder from there.
Wow. So this is kind of cool because it's easy. Fusion is much easier in the sun because of the mass of the sun and the gravity there, in the way in which that can force protons together, if I'm getting this correct. But we need to, and I want to talk a little bit more. We mentioned the lasers, which are depositing energy. I think a lot of people can conceptualize what a laser is. You've got laser pointers, et cetera. But I want to talk a bit more about these little pellets of deuterium and tritium, because I understand part of what took the NIF so goddamn long to get this happening was perfecting that little target. So you're creating that pressure by exploding and compressing something, right? Tell us about the target and what that's like, because I think we're going to get into a little bit about what this would look like to sustain it. How long did the reaction go on for? Was it this like a microsecond thing? Did it go on for a few seconds, a minute?
The reaction only went on for about 80 picoseconds, but it released more than 3 megajoules. But this is something that kind of drives me nuts. A lot of people focus on the time and are like, oh, well, it's useless. We have to make it go billions of times longer, or trillions or whatever. Completely ignoring that every day we get into a vehicle that is powered by tiny explosions that go off constantly. This is basically a diesel engine for fusion. That's what the NIF is. And because we just compress it really hard till she burns. And it's completely copying how nuclear weapons initiate fusion as well. So that's the reason this path was chosen. There's 2 primary paths for fusion, magnetic and inertial. And inertial was picked because we knew it worked. It was the only one that you can 100% point to a real world example. And now we have 2 that we can point to where inertial works. But you are right. We have these little pellets. We had to make them very, very perfect. And the reasoning for that is, in a nuclear weapon, if you ever look at the designs for how a thermonuke works, you'll notice the whole thing's pretty crude and big. And there's compression. The nuke's only on one side and the hydrogen portion's over here. How does that compress effectively when you hear that the NIF has to be so focused to make such good compression? And there's tricks. There's super secret BS that I don't know. And if I knew, I couldn't tell you. But also, you get a cheat with fission. Like that's the number one thing to always come back to is fission is amazing. It provides you just this stunning, incredible amount of power instantly. And so you can get around any imperfections by just being more powerful. It's a thing we talk about in the inertial world a lot, that if we just had bigger lasers, then we don't need as much perfection. But the NIF was built on the very ragged edge of what we thought could work for ignition. It was based on underground tests that were meant to simulate ideas of how inertial confinement would work, and based on smaller lasers that had been built. And the original proposal was we have to have a 10 megajoule laser, and we think that'll do it based on the nuclear weapons testing. And Congress went, no way, we will not give you a 10 megajoule laser. So they went back and they reran their simulations, and fusion simulations are the most untrustworthy things in the world, but they went, sure, okay, 2 megajoules if we're really, really, really good. And Congress went, fine, we'll fund a 2 megajoule laser, and you guys can do all this stockpile stewardship stuff with it and play with fusion. That's the most we'll fund. So because of that, they had to get really, really, really good, not only with the laser irradiation, the spots, the timing, the pointing, everything, but the targets had to be made perfect. So the actual little pellets themselves, you can imagine this little tiny thing the size of a period at the end of a sentence that is filled up with deuterium, tritium, ice. And the pellets are made out of things like diamond or beryllium to be able to make really perfect, smooth, and strong surfaces. And then in the case of the NIF, they're placed inside of a little tiny gold case called a hull realm. And this is very similar to how a nuke works. And the idea is the lasers hit the hull realm, they heat the hull realm up, and the hull realm emits X-rays. It gets so hot. Like, have you ever seen metal get white hot? Imagine if it got X-ray hot. And then the X-rays ablate the outside of the pellet. You get a rocket effect, and the pellet goes compressing in as all the stuff's flying off. And the pellet compresses in at 400 kilometers per second. I mean, everything in this is just unbelievably extreme. But the reason they went that way, because you'll think like, wait a second, the lasers don't even hit the pellet, and it's got to make X-rays, and a bunch of those X-rays are going to leak, and this has got to be so inefficient. And it is. It's horribly inefficient. It's called indirect drive. The reason they did it is that's how nukes work. And once again, it was, let's do it the way we are sure is going to work. There's a billion different good ideas. For instance, in Rochester, we don't do indirect drive. Well, we will if people ask for it, but that's not our primary thing. We actually directly ablate the pellets with the lasers, which is a much more efficient way of doing it. But when they were designing the NIF, they didn't know how good lasers were going to be in the future. So they went, we're going to use the laser tech we have, which the design was finalized in 1992. It got approved in 94 for construction. So that means they were using lasers that were a mature technology in maybe 1986.
Wow.
Maybe. You always have to pick older technology because you need to be able to build it, right? You talk about this a lot on the show. You have to actually have a supply chain. You can't just pick something that some guy made in a lab that's this big and says, oh, I think it's going to be super efficient, magical. You have to pick something that you can contract to a company, and they'll, build 192 laser beams for you. So that's what they ended up. That's how the NIF ended up the way it did.
So I love what you said earlier about, people saying, hey, it only lasted for a picosecond or a fraction of a picosecond. We've got to, make billions of these to actually sustain it for any amount of time that's going to be, congruent to running a power plant eventually. And you mentioned, well, that's what happens in a diesel engine. There's all these individual little hydrocarbon molecules that are oxidizing and, burning up essentially. But then when you describe, these deuterium, tritium pellets, each of them seems like it's this, I don't even know what analogy to use, this like perfect jewel, this like diamond, this pearl that has just been polished. And the idea of creating billions of those to go off sequentially seems bizarre. Like, you mentioned, and you've been sort of teasing at this, that a lot of this research, particularly at Triple L, has to do with stockpile stewardship. Maybe this is a moment to sort of talk a little bit more about Triple L as a facility, and you mentioned that this path towards inertial confinement had a lot to do with nuclear weapons. So why don't we chat about that a little bit and get a better understanding of that while I fix my camera here?
Yeah, sounds good. So Lawrence Livermore National Labs is one of the younger national labs. All the ones that we know the names of, like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge are from the Manhattan Project days directly. Livermore was a spinoff because there was a fight between weapons scientists, and it came out of work that was already happening at
That sounds
Berkeley.
potentially messy.
Yeah, well, if you ever heard of Edward Teller, he wasn't friendly to a lot of people, and he went off and started Livermore. Hilariously enough, it was actually partially driven by his want to make the hydrogen bomb, or as they called it, the super. And a lot of people at Los Alamos were not into the idea. But it took him so long and he had to burn so many bridges to get Livermore going that Los Alamos built the first hydrogen bomb before he could even get his lab going. And so Livermore is famous for always being in tight competition with Los Alamos. And they had a lot of very young, bright scientists there right around the time the laser was invented, which is how they have always been the champion of inertial confinement fusion. Because once we got hydrogen bombs, a lot of people started thinking, man, if there was only a way to do fusion like this, but without a nuclear weapon, then it might make sense. We might be able to actually do it easily rather than these big magnetic monsters. And the moment, I think it's like 2 years after the laser gets invented, one of our best bomb designers, John Knuckles, writes the seminal paper saying, well, if you had lasers like this, you'll be able to do inertial confinement fusion with lasers, and this is what we should pursue. And so Livermore has always had this big focus on developing lasers and developing inertial confinement fusion. And it was always closely tied with the weapons work. It was weapons designers that were involved with it. A lot of the stuff was classified. From what I can tell, the first fusion company ever was started about inertial confinement because of the same idea with lasers. And they had a huge fight with the AEC before the NRC and the DOE were created, the Atomic Energy Commission. They had this massive classification fight. Because they said, we're going to do this fusion thing. And the AEC said, hey, that's secret bomb tech. And these guys said, well, we came up with it ourselves. It's not our fault that it's secret bomb tech. And funnily enough, the first ever laser fusion experiment was not done at Livermore. And they are very bitter about that fact. It was done at a private company in Wisconsin. But the physics from the compression we can do with lasers has always been very interesting for bomb scientists. There's a lot of indications that some designs were updated based on things that they learned, how to make better, smaller, more efficient bombs, blah, blah, blah. But then we get near the end of the Cold War, and it looks like we're going to stop doing underground testing entirely. That's where everything's going. And everyone's getting pretty freaked out about that because of two major things. One, our bombs are old. The vast majority of them are from the 60s. And you ever think about if you had to go start a car from the 60s, would you trust it to turn on? So a lot of people were worried about that. And then the other thing is we would lose the knowledge base. So you imagine, just like with building nuclear power plants, if you don't build any for 30, 40, however many years, you might not know how to do it later. Even if you have the paperwork in front of you for how to do it, right. You're going to lose all the little things. And so this idea of stockpile stewardship came up, that we're going to do research, we're going to build machines that allow us to do research on the conditions of nuclear weapons and better understand what's going on in them so that we can update our codes, make sure that all the little subcomponents still work properly, but also train bomb scientists. So if you are designing inertial confinement experiments at the NIF, you implicitly know a lot of things for how to design a nuclear weapon, even if you don't know that. It's like we're teaching you in secret. And it also is, this is a common thing in the DOE science world. It gives everyone a toy to play with, and you have to eat your vegetables and do a little bit of bomb work. And as a reward, you get to do fun experiments with this giant laser we built for you.
It's an interesting kind of psychological mechanism, right? Because I imagine being a weapons scientist, if you're not a sociopath, is kind of tricky to balance in your head. And there's lots of ways I'm sure you can sort of moralize and justify it, but probably it is nice to have what you're saying there, this kind of toy to distract yourself with.
I've also heard it's just incredibly boring. Now, you got to think, once again, we haven't set them off in a long time. What do you do all day? You probably just confirm things on codes and go, yup, I bet it still works. God, I hate my life. I'm working on weapons and it's boring.
Right. And one other thing I heard, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but we hear about the massive amount of military spending the U.S. does, for instance. But I think Livermore is funded under the DOE, and a lot of the stockpile stewardship research is DOE. So in reality, the U.S. military budget's even bigger when you.
This is actually a really fun side note. The entire weapons related portion of the DOE, which is called the NNSA, they pay my check, by the way. They fund the entire lab I'm at. I am funded under an NNSA fellowship.
What does that stand for?
That
NNSA?
National Nuclear Security Administration. So it's
Okay.
in the United States, the nuclear weapons are technically owned and ran by civilians under the DOE. It's this weird sharing thing that's kind of been around forever. That goes back to the AEC. The NNSA is funded by the military. So the DOE is given a certain budget by Congress, and then the NNSA gets their budget from the Department of Defense. But like I said, we do get these giant cool machines that do other things. So most of the time on, say, the NIF or the Omega laser here in Rochester is not doing fusion. And very, very, very few shots are ever classified or anything directly related to weapons work. We do a lot of just pure science with it. So honestly, I think it's like the best deal ever. We get, a couple $1 billion from the military to do weapons work, of which most of it is just cool science. They take, those lasers have other applications for scientifically, nothing practical, but like we can simulate the interior of planets and stars and understand astrophysics and, on and on and on and on. And it all comes from the DoD writing us a big check for a cool machine.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So let's dig in a little bit more. Again, I was sort of teasing at that issue of these pellets, how perfect they are. Of course, in the popular press, people are saying this is a breakthrough moment. This is maybe the Kitty Hawk moment, similar to when the Wright brothers got an engine, a lawnmower engine on their proper wing shapes and were able to sustain flight for 14 seconds. This is the beginning of that. We're going to see limitless clean power. It's very reminiscent of when people, wind and solar enthusiasts talk about sort of free energy from the sun and the wind. Neglecting, of course, all of the steel and concrete and rare earth minerals within the actual weather harvesting machines. I just want to understand a little bit more the fuel, how it's made, and how we would potentially step up inertial confinement with lasers to actual power production. How many laser shots a day can you do at your lab, or can they do at Triple L? How efficient are the lasers? How much room is there to improve that? How many of these little pellets can we build and sort of line up to set off these little thermonuclear explosions? What do you see as the main rate limiting factors in trying to turn the announcement that they had and what they did into usable power for the grid?
Yeah, so I'll start out with that Kitty Hawk analogy first. I actually think it's fine to compare this to Kitty Hawk because the Kitty Hawk airplane also sucked, but it proved we could fly. The difference being is we don't need to go from the Kitty Hawk plane to a Sopwith Camel. We need to go from the Kitty Hawk plane to a 747. All the steps in between are basically useless. We have to hit the 747 before this becomes useful. Doesn't mean the Kitty Hawk moment isn't a big deal, but it does kind of ignore that we have a lot left. We'll start with the pellets. The pellets are always rightfully so focused on. They're very expensive. They're custom made. However, the reasoning behind that is we can't shoot the lasers very often. So there's kind of this chicken and an egg problem. Why would you ever make a lot of pellets if you can't use them? There have been test programs where they've tried making a lot of pellets rapidly, and they can do it. And it's the comparisons I've heard are, it's kind of like thinking about semiconductors. The first time someone ever made a computer chip, it was a custom made insane thing that you could never imagine mass producing. And now we make millions of them without a problem. But you have to have the large capital investment, and there's going to be a lot of R&D to get it to the point where you need it to, where it's going to work. There is no just throw $1 million and we'll already start making pellets at mass production. There is interest, there's projects, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's not happening tomorrow. It's not happening this decade.
How many pellets are we talking about? Say, like if we were to run this for a day, are we talking about thousands, millions, billions, trillions of pellets?
There are, I should have that number and I don't, but it depends on how fast you want to shoot the power plant. And that comes into, there's an interesting design space with inertial confinement fusion because we can get what's called very high gain. In theory, we've never shown it.
Is gain the Q? Is that what?
There's a lot of bad numbers being thrown around. Gain is, when we talk about the recent experiment, We'll talk about scientific gain. So we had a scientific gain of 1.5. We got 3 megajoules out versus 2 megajoules in. But we had an engineering gain of like 0.00 something because the lasers consumed far too much electricity. Also, there's no ability to convert power at the NIF anyways. But gain...
And when you say convert power, you're saying the 3 megajoules you got out, running that through a working fluid and turning a
turbine and
in
all
which
the
case
other
you'd be 40%
crap.
efficient and lose about another half or something, right? So,
yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'd never get it back around that way. Now, all fusion systems have to have... I like to think about it as gain. There's other different ways of talking about it, but it's it's a factor of energy out versus energy in. And it's always worth talking about both scientific and engineering because sometimes you can get very high scientific gain, very poor engineering gain. Maybe they're middling. It depends on all these different concepts. There's a million fusion concepts, but specifically with ICF, the one very important, neat trick that we should be able to do, a big emphasis on should, but we're basing this off weapons experience, is get very, very high gains. Because once the fusion burn starts happening in a well-compressed pellet, it should consume a lot of the fuel at once. MCF the magnetic systems often struggle with much lower gains, but they make up for that with trying to make more efficient overall systems. In ICF, there's a whole debate about do you try and make something with very, very high gain? There are ideas where there's basically no limit as to how high you could push it. And deal with these massive explosions every couple minutes, or do you make something much lower gain and try and shoot it faster? But at minimum, we're talking, you need to be throwing a pellet once every 3 or 4 seconds, up to multiple times per second and firing. So you're going to need a lot of them.
Like again, I think part of the journalism on fusion that we both find frustrating is it's kind of like a lot of the the hype around using hydrogen now. Like in where I'm at right now, they're going to be blending in homeopathic amounts of hydrogen into natural gas to greenwash natural gas plant operation. But there's this idea with fusion that it basically turns water into energy. And deuterium and tritium are not H2O. They're very special forms of hydrogen. And while it's sort of framed as, well, the fuel's limitless and it's here, it's in a form that's really fucking hard to get and to concentrate, to purify. And
well, the deuterium isn't hard. That's a very easy thing to get a hold of. There's plenty of it.
We run heavy water reactors, and that's a big uranium enrichment we don't have to do up here in Canada. But heavy water still is pretty expensive. Like I was just actually at the this is a big tangent, but I was at the Dark Matter Research Center at the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, and they ran a neutrino test in the 90s, and they had to borrow heavy water from Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, I believe, and it was $300 million worth of heavy water that they needed to pour into a tank for one of their sensors. So it's not cheap. Am I right?
Yeah.
Like, are you just saying it's cheap because tritium is so fucking expensive, or is deuterium really that easy?
As with all nuclear things, it's always important to remember fusion is also nuclear, so it gets the same fun benefit of. You just don't need much fuel. So we need like 70 kilos of deuterium a year for a gigawatt power plant. It just doesn't matter. The fuel cost ends up being like nothing compared to everything else in the power plant. I think it would literally end up as a rounding error.
And much less than you need to fill a calandria of a can-do up with a gobsmacking amount of heavy water. Okay, I got you there. Okay, so the amount in the pellets is quite small.
Oh, excruciating, like micrograms in each pellet. The tritium, on the other hand, is the tricky one. So any fusion power plant that wants to use DT, which once again, easiest fuel to try and do, anything beyond DT is somewhere in the range of 30 times harder to potentially impossible. We do know that pure deuterium can be forced to fuse as well, because IV Mike was a pure deuterium thermonuclear weapon. But once again, much, much harder. So there's very few people looking directly at that. DT is by far the favored one. And just for everyone's reference, tritium is super heavy hydrogen. It's radioactive. It's got about 12-year half-life. There's no supply on Earth worth mentioning. We have to make it. Right now, all the labs like mine get our supply from Canada, directly from CANDUs. There is also weapons supply that is used for things like the NIF. That the U.S. government, Russia, China, et cetera, breed their own tritium from lithium. So the plan for a future power plant, and this is where things get really, really tricky, like ignoring the pellets or anything else, I would say just abstracting to a future fusion power plant of arbitrary type. we have to breed the tritium in situ, and every fusion reaction makes one neutron. And that one neutron needs to go off and make more than one tritium. So we have to have a really, really efficient breeding blanket to make this happen. In theory, you can do it. No one's ever done it. I assume there's probably going to be quite a bit of R&D. There was decades of R&D on fission breeders. They never quite reached the breeding ratios that they wanted to reach. And life's a lot easier for fission breeders than for fusion breeders because the reactor will just keep running even if it's not a breeder. In fusion, you have to make it happen. You have to cycle the tritium out in real time while the reactor is running, usually out of something like liquid lithium and lead mixed together that'll be running through your walls, which is a whole different materials nightmare that people have to come up with how to handle. Cycle out the tritium, efficiently put it into whatever form is going to be your fuel, and then feed it back in. And you also have to deal with the fact that tritium likes to soak into everything. So especially these magnetic confinement reactors, where you can imagine they're like a big donut that's just full of DT plasma everywhere. They have this problem with some of the experiments where the tritium just soaks into the walls. It just gets everywhere. So you have to have even more tritium to even start the reactor. It's just like a tax of tritium you have to pay. So they talk about like the ITER fusion project in France, which is a giant tokamak, will basically consume the entire world supply of tritium just to start up. Because it's just got to soak the freaking walls with tritium, and then they have to try and breed more. And there was concern actually about you're helping the fusion community, by the way, by saving Pickering and things like that, because there is major concern that as CANDUs close down, we will lose all tritium supply for experiments.
Wow. Well, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah,
Although
really helpful.
There was a company that was going to detitriate the water from Pickering, and now they've put that on hold. I'm friends with some people involved in that company. They had mixed feelings, but yes, for the long-term viability of the tritium supply, Pickering being around longer is a good thing. This is a cool anecdote you might find interesting. We have a detitriation plant at Darlington next to one of our, this is one of our 4-unit sites. And they, as part of this process, they produced this interesting waste product, which they hadn't really monetized. I was talking to some guys that worked there and just said the physics of that detitration plant are extraordinary. They ended up having this huge tank of helium-3. And someone, from the finance department had a look at it and said, I think we're sitting on $4 billion of helium-3 right now. I might have the number off. It was definitely billions, right? But helium-3 is another source I've heard. I was in preparing for this. I don't want to go off too much because I know there's all sorts of different forms of fusion. I think it's simplest to think about inertial and magnetic on one side. There's some combinations. There's helion, I think, which is experimenting with helium fuels and maybe more of a, I don't know. I don't think I really understood it. I watched one video on it, but maybe more of a particle accelerator approach to fusion. I'm losing track of my question here. We were talking about tritium.
Well, you were talking about helium-3, which I do want to point
helium-3.
out. I made a Twitter thread actually about this, about how the CANDUs basically run the world on helium-3. If they actually pull all the helium-3 out, whole world supply taken care of. But that's not for fusion. You'll find this little number fun because I talked about this with a friend of mine. They said, well, could the tritium supply just be handled by having like CANDUs and DT reactors, and they'll work together, right? Each PWR, or I'm sorry, all the PHWRs in the world, so that's Canada, India, and Romania, make about 4.5 kilos of tritium per year. But for a DT reactor, we need something like 70 kilos per year for a 1 gigawatt power plant. So there's no possible way. All the CANDUs in the world can't keep it going. And the same issue holds for the helium-3, because helium-3 is the decay product of tritium. And it is a potential fusion fuel. We actually use it at Omega. Sometimes we'll do helium-3 shots, not to try it and reach ignition because it's 30x harder than DT. We use it because it produces a unique type of radiation that's helpful for some experiments where we'll have a fusion explosion and then we'll take a picture of it with another fusion explosion, which is pretty neat.
One of the things we talked about, I think, in our last conversation was particularly with DT reactions. These are heavy isotopes of hydrogen. I guess when those protons fuse, some neutrons go zipping off. And those neutrons are just fucking bowling balls. I'm not sure what the right analogy is, but we were talking about how they knock all the, atoms out of a metal lattice 30 times. I forget what time unit, but they're just bashing everything. When I looked at some of the animations of the triple L laser shots, I mean, there's a bunch of really finicky, fancy looking equipment there. What's the implications in terms of the kind of neutron damage to those facilities in terms of an engineering challenge or a feasibility challenge? We've talked about now, I guess. Well, we've talked about the pellets themselves. Let's talk a little bit about neutrons, and then we'll talk about lasers a bit more.
Yeah. So the neutrons, once again, abstracting to any kind of fusion reactor, are a massive concern. Neutron damage is in a fusion reactor is just like nothing we've ever seen in the fission world. We can't even simulate it properly with a fission reactor because we just can't get the damage, because the neutrons from DT fusion are 7x more energetic than the fastest neutrons from fission, and you make way more of them. 80% of the power from a DT fusion reactor is neutrons. Compare that to, what's my number for fission? 2.5% is neutrons from fission. And that's actually sandbagging fission, because most of those neutrons in fission have to go back into making more fission. Whereas in fusion, all of those neutrons come out, baby, and they got to stop somewhere. And you're trying to stop them in lithium and lead so that you can make more tritium. But like you said, they're going to hit other things, and they will do an unbelievable amount of damage. Knocking lattices, metal lattices out. I think it's like 30 knocks per year or something crazy like that. It's like nothing we've ever dealt with. Yeah. Just being beaten.
And in a fission plant, I mean, those neutrons are being generated inside a great big steel, reactor pressure vessel. They're colliding with stuff that's pretty simple. And when I looked at the animation from Triple L, it was just, they're going to be colliding with some pretty high tech instrumentation, it looked like.
Yeah. So, but interestingly enough, that's actually one of the proposed advantages of any kind of ICF facility. And it's important to remember ICF can be abstracted away from just lasers. There's other ways to do the same trick, but lasers are favored for a variety of political and technical reasons that'll take a whole different podcast to get into. But the nice part is most of the really expensive stuff is actually very far away and well shielded. So like the laser amplifiers, which for the case of Livermore are the size of 3 football fields. Whoa. Those are so safe from, there's nothing. No radiation dose at all by those. You compare that to some other fusion systems where they have to put, say, a magnet 1 foot away from the fusion plasma. They kind of get the crap beaten out of them. And so that's always been one of the arguments for ICF is you don't have to put at least very much high-tech equipment within the hell radiation zone. What that ends up being in reality, I don't know. I think we kind of need to, I'm hoping that we can build future facilities and find out really what the damage looks like. But the National Ignition Facility, when they have done damage to themselves with fusion neutrons, and other fusion reactor experiments have done similar things. It's one of the 1,000 miracles we have to get working for a real good, reliable fusion power plant.
So let's talk about lasers now. And I think the way that you mentioned, there's other ways to kind of deposit that energy into the DT to make it do something. I'm curious what those are. But we've talked about using a fission bomb as a way to get ignition happening, and now they've done it with lasers. We talk about the kind of efficiency limits, say, of a solar panel. I think it's the Shockley-Kaiser limit, around 40% maximum efficiency. The Betz limit for wind is around 40, I think, as well. And there's the Carnot limits for internal combustion or gas turbines. I forget what. The lasers you mentioned at Lawrence Livermore are super old and super inefficient. Lasers have gotten a lot better. What's the kind of maximum efficiencies we're seeing with lasers? How cool are lasers? Tell me more about lasers. You love lasers. They sound really awesome. I don't know. I know fuck all about lasers.
Yeah. They're a neat piece of technology. So yeah, the Livermore lasers are very old, and they're old and poor efficiency, like I said, on purpose because of the age and also cost. They picked a technology that was going to be cheap to build the system. I always think it's fun. People like to talk about the cost of Livermore or of the NIF. It was about $4 billion over budget. That's a lot of money. I'll agree, but it was also over a pretty long period of time. And you compare that to, say, ITER, which is estimated to be between, $30 and $60 billion and is still not finished. I think the U.S. made the better investment. Yeah, those lasers are something like 0.1% electrically efficient. They use a flash lamp to put the energy into the laser. So think like an old-timey camera with that big white powerful flash. That's how we put the energy in. Most of that's heat. That doesn't do anything for the laser because the laser needs one particular wavelength of light to get pumped up to the energy or to become a laser. I won't get into the laser physics, but it needs only one little portion of that white light spectrum, similar to how a solar panel can't use very much of the sun's spectrum. We have way, way better lasers nowadays. We even had them back then, but it wasn't a good choice for a scientific facility that was so kind of pushing the limits anyways. So there's very, very efficient lasers like laser diodes that are getting up above 50% electrically efficient. We cannot use, so that's like a laser pointer. We can't use those for inertial confinement fusion. They don't have some of the right characteristics. When we look at lasers that actually have the correct characteristics, so they can make big pulses of energy, they need to be ultraviolet. There's some beam quality stuff that they have to have. There are two options. There are basically a hyper modified version of what Livermore is using right now, which is very similar to what's also being tested for laser weapons. Before they become ICF usable, they're something like 40% electrically efficient. After we beat the laser hard enough to make it be useful for fusion, they're more like 15% electrically efficient. That's still a heck of a lot better than 0.01. And those lasers also can fire a lot. So Livermore can only fire 3 times a day. And that's because of the heating of the laser and putting the targets in and all the other complexities that slow them down. Because the targets are put in by hand and hand aligned and all this stuff that you can imagine ways to pretty easily do it better with just some modern techniques. So 15% efficient with that type of laser. The other option is an excimer laser, which some people might be familiar with because they're used for LASIK. I actually got that done a couple weeks ago. Got shot right in the face with a UV laser. Works great.
That's called informed consent when you go to an ophthalmologist and they have to get your consent. You were truly informed, I think, knowing exactly what that.
I was a little too informed. I was telling them to drug me up fast because I knew a little too much about what was about to hit me. But those lasers have been investigated for ICF for a long time by the Navy and for other weapons related crap. And those are about 15 to 18% efficient and also have already been built and shown to fire really rapidly. The Navy has a laser called Nike that does this. They did a bunch of testing to see, could you ever even make ICF possible? You had to, I was telling you, they tried making a lot of little pellets. They did this whole program called Happles where they made pellets really fast. They didn't load them with fuel. They were just curious if you could make pellets fast, shoot them into a chamber, and hit them with a laser at once a second. And they showed they could. And they did it, I think it was like 1 million or 2 million times just to prove that it was at all even barely feasible. So the lasers are definitely looking better. Still, we'd like to see more, and we have to build them. The lasers I'm talking about are at the kilojoule scale. We need to show hundreds of them to really make this work right, all linked together to try and make some sort of power plant or power plant analog. I'm not thinking about power plants anytime soon. I'm thinking more like pilot facilities, like those very first fission reactors way before shipping port. Think like EBR-1, I think, is the next phase we need to consider for fusion. But there's other options too to deposit that energy. So lasers are one really good one. There's also particle beams. So we can use a particle accelerator like they have at CERN in Switzerland. Those are nice because they're really electrically efficient. They're already built for high rep rate. So they fire really rapidly without a problem. But they're, big. So you're talking, that's kind of the end theme you might notice here is every time we're talking about something with fusion, we're talking big. We're talking a machine that is going to take up some space, and you have to think about it at a gigawatt scale. It blows me away when people talk about small fusion reactors. I'm like, what are you guys smoking? The amount of equipment and personnel and money, the only way it could ever make sense from what I can tell from my perspective is you're going to have to make them big. They're going to have to be, a 3 gigawatt power plant, and doing R&D to get to that point is also challenging.
So I think I'm like conceptually, I think we've explored some of the challenges here. One being the fuel itself, making those little beads, the tritium, sourcing that in particular. Another being neutron damage. And the third being the enormous amounts of energy that we need to sort of deposit in to get it going, what's been referred to, I think, as parasitic load. And that can either be all the energy to charge up your magnets at a magnetic confinement operation, or to charge your lasers, and whatever the source of energy is that you need to put in. On the fusion side, sorry, on the fission side of things, there was a good episode on the Power Hungry podcast. Shoutouts of always to Robert Bryce with Ray Rothrock, who's a venture capitalist with some interest in fusion and had some interesting things to say. He was saying, listen, on the fusion side, fusion gets past the issues of decay heat, which kind of haunt fission in terms of managing decay heat and the event of loss of coolant and things like that. It gets around the problems of waste, and I'm not sure if he said this, but it seems like that fusion, there's a lot of fusion research, a lot of prototypes, a lot of stuff happening in a way that you don't see happening with fission. And I'm not sure if fusion is under the proviso or the regulation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in America, but it really seems like, you hear about endless startups. I think there's $4.8 billion of private capital in fusion projects. There's lots of, workshops with people setting up their own lasers. You mentioned that they actually managed to do a laser shot outside of Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in a private facility first. I think these challenges of the two technologies are interesting. On the fission side, I think what Ray was saying is a little overhyped. I mean, we've managed decay heat pretty well. There's been a couple accidents. They've been pretty inconsequential from a human health perspective. The waste, I think, has been overblown. But again, on the fusion side, I guess I'm interested in the regulation and whether fusion falls under the arbitrage of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, if there's regulatory hurdles or not really.
So fusion does. It is under the NRC, but right now it's basically treated like particle accelerators are regulated, which is very, very loosely. It's not nearly as much of a pain in the neck to handle. You just kind of have to prove you're not going to kill someone with the radiation and you're okay. However, the tritium is heavily regulated by the NRC. As you probably know about tritium regulations, annoying and horrible. The U.S. limits on tritium are very, very low. And all fusion reactors will make tritium just like all fission reactors will. Even if you were doing a deuterium, ideal fusion reactor that just used seawater as its fuel, it'll still make tritium, and there'll be tritium to handle. You might be able to keep it all circulating in the reactor, but I would assume you're probably going to have tritium issues to deal with the NRC. But also the NRC is writing rules now for fusion power plants because, we might as well strangle the new industry right in the crib. We'll see how that really works, but I don't know if you've seen the new advanced reactor rules from the NRC. I am not hopeful that anything good will come out on the fusion side. But I want to address a couple of the other points also from that. I listened to the same episode from Power Hungry, and it kind of gets into some of the perpetual myths with fusion as well. You're right that decay heat won't be as big of an issue. However, there will be decay heat. There will be prompt decay heat from the activation of the reactor. That massive neutron flux will activate the heck out of the reactor. And there are actual concerns about partial melts of fusion reactors upon rough shutdown. It's not likely to be as nearly big of a deal. It'll decay faster, blah, blah, blah. But you could definitely damage it, and you don't have this giant body of water. The inside of a fusion reactor is vacuum. Really hard to get rid of heat in vacuum. So if you lose your cooling pumps, it wouldn't be the craziest thing to imagine your very, very, very expensive fusion reactor kind of sloughs over in a giant pile of super radioactive nastiness, because also the prompt decay activity is very, very high, and maintenance on fusion reactors is already a problem because once again, you don't have that water cover. If you've been to a nuclear power plant, you see how they move the rods around. They're all covered by water. It's very easy. You bolt onto these things and a guy can just move the crane himself. In a fusion reactor, we can fill the inside back up with air and people can go inside, but then it's going to be extremely radioactive. It's already radioactive enough from simple experiments that we often wait days. For the NIF, part of why they were waiting so long to make the announcement is because they had to wait for the whole thing to get to lower in radioactivity enough to go pull some of the detectors out and check them. There's work on like robots to do maintenance and things like that. It's another one of these challenges. But also on the waste front, activation makes radioactive waste. Just like there's radioactive waste from accelerators, there's radioactive waste from medicine, and a lot of the stuff from fusion is going to be in that kind of intermediate level that, it's not low level waste that you can immediately throw away. We'll have to actually have a decay time. We'll have to manage it. And because of the high volumes of the machines, it's considered an issue. I can send you some IAEA papers where people are really thinking about decommissioning a large fusion reactor like ITER. It's going to be a substantial volume of waste to handle. And it's one of the interesting comparisons to fission. As you look at the total activities of the waste, fission is higher, but total activity. But then if you look at like waste per unit volume, fusion ends up being much worse. So you have to do at least these like intermediate, we have to hold on to it for like 100 years until it decays down to the point where it'll be fine. And of course, you and I know that that's actually not a big deal. That's very easy to handle. But it is very annoying to see it bandied about as not a problem at all. I am one of the things I'm perpetually worried about with fusion is that if we get let's say we get a working fusion reactor and all these promises are being made and we're building them and somehow we've sidestepped the NRC and kung fu'd our way to starting to make power plants, I'm worried about a lot of the same problems reoccurring that the fission industry, the same sort of kind of lying to people, the same just general issues that really hurt the fission industry and kind of kneecapped it. And I think fusion advocates need to think about that, and they need to read their history of nuclear power if they ever want to have real good fusion reactors on the grid and not just a one-off government project and maybe a big, mothball decommissioned facility somewhere.
Well, Garrett, we're coming up on the hour. I think I've got most of the questions I had down here answered. Is there anything else that you feel we haven't touched on that you wanted to say your piece about?
No, I think we've covered just about everything. I just really wanted to kind of push the point that what happened at Livermore was a very big deal, and we should all celebrate it. But it's not making infinite power tomorrow, and fusion's neat, but it maybe isn't everything you think it is.
The joke is always it's 20 years away. Do you have any guess on time frames? I mean, again, I thought that was really interesting. The Kitty Hawk moment that you extended that further into, like, we're not just trying to build the next shitty airplane. We'll have to get up to a level of the other power generation sources that we have. We need to get a 737 out of this. I mean, there's certainly, like you mentioned it, the journalism is either breathlessly too optimistic or probably more in rare cases just so pessimistic. And you're putting yourself somewhere in the middle there. I mean, I guess there's the possibility that this is just going to be too much of an engineering challenge to ever be viable. I mean, again, fission is a lot easier to initiate, whatever. But yeah, where do you put yourself in that perspective, I guess, or I don't know. It's a silly question, I guess, about timeframes or the degree to which it'll contribute.
I think we're very liable to see EBR1, maybe EBR2-esque test fusion reactors. That'll make net energy, and you'll power Arco, Idaho briefly with them or something like that. Within our lifetime, there's a lot of money that we've solved a lot of problems. There's a lot of just inertia to make it happen. There's big, it's a way for a government to brag. It's kind of like building a particle collider or something. You should say, I have a fusion power plant. I think stepping to, I would call that within like next 20, 30 years, I would almost guarantee we'll see one or two. The US and China will each build one and they'll brag about how amazing they are. Stepping on to actual commercial power, I don't really know. It, like you said, it could be like a lot of other niche sources of energy that it remains forever niche, or we never really step past the engineering challenges. And one of the difficult things with fusion is, unlike say like a wave generator that you can get a bunch of VC money and make a little test one and show it off and everyone goes, that's great, but it's useless. You have to spend a lot of money and time and effort to get your test fusion reactor going. So I don't know, it might never make commercial sense. Or I'm not highly optimistic for something within our lifetime, barring, a complete black swan out of the left field event. It's challenging.
So, just a little extended edition for the truly loyal Decouple listeners. We've had a couple episodes now. We had BF Randall on. I just had a great episode with Cal Abel. And obviously, electrification is part of the picture of decarbonization. But process heat is a really big deal. I always say that the challenge is not making lots of clean energy, it's replacing fossil fuel services. Can fusion be used for things like process heat? Are we going to see
Oh
fusion
yeah.
reactors? Are we going to see fusion reactors on submarines for propulsion? You got into fusion, I think, because you thought fusion rockets were super cool. So just I guess in closing, answer those questions for me.
Yeah, so fusion, if you can make a fusion power plant work, it will be real good for process heat. It'll be hard to run it cold. You will find it very easy to get those real high, at least sodium cooled reactor temperatures, if not higher. Um, that'll be an easy one to get. So I guess if you want gigawatts of process heat, there you go. Um, I don't know about ever shrinking down for a submarine. Submarines are very demanding, as Rod Adams likes to talk about. The reactor that powered his submarine went under his desk. Fusion's going to find shrinking down to those sizes much harder, but maybe. And then for space propulsion, that's really where fusion shines. That's when you start to run the numbers on that. If we ever get real sci-fi with humanity and going out to the stars, that's where fusion looks really, really good.
All right. Well, that's probably for a whole other episode to dive into that, but we'll leave that hanging out there. Garrett, thanks again for coming back, man. It's been great catching up. And you have just I can't think of a better guest to deep dive this most recent announcement with. So thank you for making the time.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.